All right, welcome everyone to the latest episode of Headlines in History, episode 45, How Syria Fell and What is Next. So as you know, you listened to episode 44, the beginning of this little two-part series. We talked about the background of Syria. We went all the way back to the beginning, empires, all that stuff. Talked about how it's a Sunni Arab country and eventually became led by Hafez Assad and his son Bashar in the latter half of the 20th century and then into the 21st century. And then they ultimately fell prey. The leadership fell prey to the Arab Spring in 2011. And then ultimately Assad is pulled from power, forced from power just recently. And this is why we're talking about Syria. So what I want to do this episode is I want to kind of break down a little bit what the groups are, because Syria is different post-Arab Spring in 2011 in that there's been an ongoing civil war that didn't return back to some level of peace after the uprisings in 2011. So there's the uprisings in 2011. They're crossing the Middle East. Egypt's dealing with it. It's not just Syria, and potentially could have been in Iraq, although it didn't oust any of the leadership. But things ended up dying down. Things ended up kind of returning to a sense of normalcy, if you will, even though there were some changes. Some leaders were ousted, Gaddafi being one of them. But some leaders were, but it didn't lead to a decade-long civil war. It didn't, but it only did in Syria. And so that's why Syria is a bit unique and interesting, given this whole Arab Spring discussion. And it didn't finally end. I guess you can say it ended since Assad left, but it didn't really finally end until just recently. So 13 years, the regime in Damascus has been fighting against the rebels who are well-trained, well-armed, and that has to do with the major players like the U.S. and Russia and Turkey, which we'll talk about. So Bashar al-Assad, bad guy, and again, he falls prey to this Arab Spring movement. And in 2011, eventually, some rebel groups start to form that want to fight against Assad, oust him, and replace his regime with a different type of leadership, a different style of government. Assad has been torturing and killing his own people. There's a famous prison outside of Damascus, Sandia prison, where 30,000 people, women, children, have all been killed and tortured. He's not a great guy, and the people that live within Syria understand that. They want the dictator to go, just like they did in the other countries. So let's talk about some of the major groups, some of the groups that you may have read about in the news that arose and were influential in the fight. So the first is what's called the Free Syrian Army, and they arose immediately upon the Arab Spring beginning in 2011. Now it was disjointed. It didn't really coalesce into something, let's say, a bit more official until 2015, and that's something we're going to see throughout this conversation today. It's really 2015 and 16 when a bunch of these rebel groups really kind of solidified and got their titles and really worked out what they were going to do. So for the first 4 years, it was kind of happenstance, if you will. It was kind of disorganized. But nonetheless, it really, at least the Free Syrian Army, formed, quote-unquote, formed in 2011, and it was begun by a guy by the name of Riyad al-Assad. Assad not being the same as the leader in Damascus, nonetheless. He's a colonel, and he has 6 friends, 6 officers that are in the military with him, and they immediately bounce out of the military and say, listen, we got to go after this Assad guy. And they become this umbrella group for multiple other organizations that started again to form in 2011, which is really it's kind of like a bunch of gangs, if you will. It's a bunch of different people from different neighborhoods who have different ideas, who have different influences, who are just like, but they all agree that Assad's not a good guy, and so they all start kind of popping up like your local gangs do. But eventually, leaders and people with more money and more people in their group themselves, those people kind of start to rise to the top. And that's what happened with the Free Syrian Army. And you can imagine why that would be the case. The colonel has been in the military. He probably has some pretty good experience. He probably knows how to lead on some level and stands out. And so he becomes the kind of the umbrella leadership for a bunch of different groups, and they all kind of find themselves under the Free Syrian Army. But what happens to the Free Syrian Army, and this happens after Russian intervention in 2015, and eventually the Turks leave in 2016, we'll talk about that in a couple minutes, they had a difficult time supporting their own operations. The Turks, obviously being on the border of Syria, all of the countries that surround Syria during this civil war don't want any of this crisis to overflow into their world, right? They don't want it to overflow across their border and to cause issues within their societies. It's pretty obvious. And so Turkey gets involved when the civil war breaks out, and it's looking to create a buffer zone, particularly because the Turks don't like the Kurds. And there are lots of Kurds that live in northern Syria, and some of them are terrorist groups, and the Turks don't want any of that nonsense, let alone in their border. They don't even want it near their border. And so what they do is they involve themselves. They send military forces into Syria, not deep, but just across the border, 10, 15, 20, 30 clicks across the border in order to create, again, this buffer zone. And they start supporting the Free Syrian Army, because there's Turkmen inside the Free Syrian Army. It's not just Arabs. And there are no Kurds whatsoever, which is what the Turks support. And the Free Syrians are like, okay, listen, we'll take some training and we'll take some money. And they were even allowed to cross the border and hang out in a safe haven in Turkey. And Turkey's like, great, we're going to end up, these are our people. They're going to be our kind of proxy element in Syria to, establish this buffer zone, and is going to do the things we want them to do, which allows us to meet our ends, right? Geopolitically or diplomatically, militarily, whatever that is. But Turkey ends up pulling out officially in 2016. They literally pull their forces out of Syria and come back across the border. Well, that creates a problem for the Free Syrian Army, because they don't have that direct connection any longer. I mean, it is obvious to see that if you have Turkish fighters literally operating within Syria, it's just easier to get weapons. It's easier to get money. It's easier to get guidance and influence and training and all these things. Well, when they leave, that becomes harder to do. And so they become weaker. And by becoming weaker, they then even increase their connection to Turkey. And Turkey then, aside from using them for their own ends in Syria, they really turn them into an ultimate proxy force. And that is for them to not only create a buffer zone and block the Kurds from eventually finding their way into Turkey, but to actually attack them, to go after groups like the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK. You may have heard of them. You may have heard them called. And they also even deploy this Free Syrian Army, which eventually finds its name. It changes its name later on to the Syrian National Army in 2017. From the Free Syrian Army to the Syrian National Army, the SNA, in 2017. Nonetheless, they ended up deploying. They went to the Caucasus and they went to Libya, to further Turkey's goals and whatever it was trying to accomplish there. And so at the time of Assad's fall, they were operating in the northwest portion of Syria, still creating that buffer zone between Turkey and Syria, and kind of doing some of Turkey's other goals, supporting Turkey's other military and diplomatic goals throughout the world. So that's one group. Starts out of the colonel and his buddies wanting to fight Assad. Free Syrian Army ends up becoming the Syrian National Army, aligned with Turkey directly. Then you have a totally different group. This group is called the Syrian Democratic Forces. And this group is backed by the United States, particularly by CJTF-OIR. So this is the Combined Joint Task Force Operation Inherent Resolve. This is the entity set up after the United States and other allies, the Brits and the Canadians, the Aussies, right? They left Iraq, as was planned. But some of them stuck around. When I say left Iraq, I mean the majority of military forces. But this combined joint task force, combined meaning multi-country, joint meaning multi-service, task force meaning not a full unit, but put together from pieces of other things, to stick around and fight ISIS. That's why initially CJTF OIR, stood up and stayed in Iraq, based in Iraq, afterwards. Eventually, the mission morphed into counter ISIS both in Iraq and Syria, because ISIS was operating in Iraq and Syria, hence the name, and found themselves involved in the Syrian Civil War after it broke out. Okay, so CJTF OIR, the United States, they end up supporting the Syrian Democratic Forces. These have Kurds. They're Kurdish-led. Now, they have Arabs and they have other ethnicities, but they are Kurdish-led. And this entity is specifically interested in creating a secular federalized government that isn't necessarily the same as the Free Syrian Army, the Turkish-backed Syrian Army. They would be interested in some type of religious component to the new government. They just don't want it to be Assad, clearly. The Syrian Democratic Forces, secular, likely to have religious influence in some way, but ultimately want a federalized system where everybody can get involved, very much like what the United States was looking to help Iraq build after we had left years before. Again, Arabs and Assyrian Syriacs are in the group too, but mainly Kurdish. This becomes a problem, as you might imagine, for Turkey. Turkey doesn't like the Kurds. They definitely don't like Kurdish terrorist groups like the PKK, but they really don't even like the Kurds at all. And so the Syrian National Army is at odds with the Syrian Democratic Forces because of the Kurdish issue. And there is some, it's more than just the fact that they're Kurdish-led. It's that there is truth that members of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, were identified as part of the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces. And so when Turkey was complaining that they didn't want to support the SDF, they would rather support the SNA, they said, because you guys are supporting terrorists. And when I say you guys, I mean the United States. And the United States even has labeled the PKK a terrorist element. We happen to support Kurdish people in the Middle East. It is the largest ethnic group without a country. We supported the Kurds in northern Iraq. They were attacked by and tortured and everything else by Saddam Hussein. Remember Halabja in 88, gassed his own people. Those were the Kurds. And so the United States has always backed the Kurds, but not the terror elements of the Kurds. And I remember this specifically when I was in Iraq in 2005. The PKK was somebody we did not work with. Nonetheless, so this creates that issue between the two different groups. The United States doesn't want the PKK. CJTF OIR doesn't want the PKK elements within their Syrian Democratic Forces. They can't do that together, right? They can't label the PKK an official terrorist organization, but then give them money so they can fight along the SDF. But at the same time, you have to understand that sometimes those things are just, you're unable to disassociate yourself from those things. And it's a real challenge. And those, by the way, the PKK members were part of what's called the YPG, the People's Protection Units. And the YPG is the military arm. So I say Syrian Democratic Forces, that's what they are, but their military arm is the YPG. And it's in that military arm that some information came out that there's PKK elements in there. And that's what Turkey was upset about, okay? So you hear YPG, it's the same thing. It's just the military arm of the SDF. Now, other than the obvious, like I had said, why we, United States, wouldn't want to support the PKK, obvious terrorist organization, it is true that sometimes the United States supports, in other countries, it's not just us, supports indirectly other elements that are a bit swarthy and maybe you wouldn't really want to work with, but if they ultimately meet another end goal, you might not find that to be moral or ethical, but nonetheless, they may help you meet an end state. You may support them. Again, indirectly in some way. But why does this incident with the PKK really matters so much to the U.S. I mean, why are they so concerned about making sure it doesn't come across that we would be supporting the PKK other than saving a little face? Turkey's a NATO partner. And this is what's made the Syria conflagration, the civil war and the issue in the region today so complicated, because Russia has found itself supporting the Assad regime. Iran has stepped up and was supporting the Assad regime. Turkey is anti-Assad regime, but anti-Kurdish. The United States is anti-Assad, and pro-Kurdish, and friends with Turkey, and not only friends, but an ally. Now, it is true that the relationship between Turkey and the rest of its NATO partners has begun to wane a bit as Erdogan, the current leader of Turkey, is becoming a bit more religious-minded, a bit more conservative. He's working very hard to shift the narrative within Turkey to a more Muslim-focused, religious, conservative government/nation than was the case coming out of the Ottoman Empire. And that's, there's issues about that throughout NATO, but nonetheless, they still are a part of NATO, and there are plenty of things that the United States and Turkey does to work together, like combating ISIS, like we do with everybody. But so it makes for a really interesting back and forth. Okay, this is what, as I have said on the show a couple of different times, what General Petraeus calls the big boy geopolitics. Operating with friends and allies across the globe can be really tricky. And as I just said, it could be downright hypocritical if there's a greater mission to play. And that's what's happening here. But the only other option to avoid behavior like that, to just throw your hands up and say, well, I don't even need to be mired in this mess, would be to not involve yourself downrange at all, and to just not be combating ISIS in Iraq, not be dealing with the Syrian Civil War, whatever. And I don't hold that view. That's an isolationist view. But, the counter argument to that is you can have an influence there. The United States can have an influence that supports its national interests. And if you don't, somebody else will. And that's just the bottom line. Whether we want to believe it or not, if we're not operating and supporting some ally in the Syrian Civil War, Russia will, and they'll have the influence. China will, or they'll have the influence. And China isn't so much involved in Syria right now, but it works in other areas. And Turkey, who may be a friend, but not all the time a friend, will have its influence in Syria. Plus, you have the fact that the United States got involved in Iraq, whether you support it or not. We did, and we still own that specific issue. And we can't have Iraq be affected by what's happening in Syria next door because of all of this issue. So we must be involved. But by being involved, you find yourself in big boy geopolitics. And so it's part of the game, if you will. It's sometimes you find yourself in the position where you have to make difficult choices to say, I think the best way for Syria to come out from this civil war, the benefit for the Syrian people, the benefit for the region, is for a democratic, federalized, secular government to take hold, which is exactly what the SDF wants. And they happen to be Kurdish-led, and we're very good friends with the Kurds. And it seems to make the most sense. But not everybody agrees. Not all of your other allies. Big boy geopolitics. It's challenging, but you got to work through it. Who else is also involved? Well, ISIS, as you might imagine. And they're the outlier in the sense that, and we've talked about this, they're the outlier in the sense that everybody hates ISIS and ISIS hates everybody else. And ISIS is only involved in anything that supports ISIS. That's why they broke off from Al-Qaeda. I don't remember if we've done a history of ISIS on the show before. I'll have to look back. I think we did. I think we talked about Zarqawi and then how it turned into Baghdadi and nonetheless. But they only like themselves, whether you wanted to call them ISIL in the beginning, Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, or ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. But then there's just IS, the Islamic State, because they have ISIS-K, which is the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, K, which is Khorasan, which is Afghanistan. So it gets a little funky there, but nonetheless, everybody hates ISIS and ISIS hates everybody else. So they're running around and causing havoc against everybody. And as I said, CJTF OIR is there, and that's not just the United States. I'll make that clear. It's Germany, France, Iraq, Norway, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the UAE. So there's plenty of allies, some of them NATO, some of them not, that are working with the United States to counter ISIS. Now, not everybody that's involved in the OIR Inherent Resolve mission is interested in, I don't want to use the word meddling, but getting involved in some way with supporting one group or the other in the Syrian Civil War. That is certainly something the United States is interested in, but they are certainly there to combat ISIS. What we don't want to see is ISIS taking over Mosul like they did, and then having to go in and clear out the city like the U.S. did with our British and Canadian friends. And then we have the Russians. I talked a little bit about Turkey. They want the border, the buffer zone there against the Kurds. And the Russians are there. I think I talked about this last episode. They're interested because they like to needle the United States, usually against the United States. Unless it comes to terrorism, we definitely support each other when it comes to ISIS. The United States, we talked about this previously, the United States sent intelligence about the ISIS attack in Moscow at the music theater last year. We certainly work together when it comes to terrorism of that nature. But we don't work together when it comes to geopolitics, nationalist geopolitics. The Russians wanted access to Tartus, the warm water port there in Syria, and the Russians have its own motives throughout the Middle East. And so we certainly aren't in any agreement there. We're not fighting about it, but we're operating in the same land. And when I say operating, I mean driving convoys of military vehicles literally in the same places. But, probably collecting intelligence on each other too, So Russia's in there as well. Okay, there's one more group, and the group that is the one you hear about on the news today, they weren't one of the originals, so the Syrian National Army or the SDF, who were messing around for most of the time. This group is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. They formed in 2017. So they weren't there at the outset in 2011, and didn't really coalesce in 2015 like some of the other groups did. But they came out in 2017 and claimed themselves to be an alternative to both the SNA and SDF. They were like, listen, we've got the same motives. We're interested in doing the same things, but we're not interested in doing it the way the SNA and SDF did. We got our own mission and our own ideals, but we still hate Assad. So they joined the mix in this civil war. They literally call themselves a new stage in the life of the Blessed Revolution. That's the quote, a new stage in the life of the Blessed Revolution. The problem with what we now call HTS, so Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, is that the group is made up of multiple smaller groups. This is a reoccurring theme here. The group is made up of smaller groups, becomes an umbrella organization. And one of those smaller groups was the Al-Nusra Front. The Al-Nusra Front was an organization that popped up right after the Arab Spring, 2011-2012 timeframe. Al-Nusra pops up, and they're tied to Al-Qaeda. So they don't like Assad, but they link themselves with Al-Qaeda and are fighting against the regime. They officially declare openly their relationship in 2013. A lot of people believe it happened before then, but nonetheless, openly in 2013. And so Al-Nusra is running around as one of these mini groups, if you will. But it finds itself underneath this coalescing HTS in 2017. And so the United States does not support HTS for obvious reasons because of its connection to Al-Qaeda. Particularly because the leader of the umbrella HTS team, this guy by the name of Ahmed Hussein al-Shara, he basically goes by a nom de guerre, which is Abu Muhammad al-Jilani. He is a designated terrorist by the United States. He fought in Iraq against U.S. forces when we were there. And he was aligned with Al-Qaeda when he was part of Al-Nusra before they designed and created HTS. And so the U.S. right there is not interested in supporting HTS. They allow HTS, in a way, to operate and do whatever the heck it's going to do because it's fighting against Assad, but the SDF is the U.S.'s partner, the Kurdish-led group. Why? Big boy geopolitics again. HTS fights Assad. Fighting Assad hurts Russia and hurts Iran. Bigger goals, so we're not necessarily going after this al-Qaeda guy, but we're letting him do what he's going to do in order to meet a bigger end for us. HTS ends up being the entity that wins, if you will, just recently, when all of these groups have been fighting against Assad, that led to Assad's fall. And ultimately the whole reason we're having this discussion. So this civil war is going on and on and on, with some groups making some headway. They lose, they win, they come back, whatever. But they all generally have their location. You have the Turkish-backed group up in the northwest. You have the SDF, which is kind of in the northeast. You had HTS, which owned some property or controlled some property closer to Damascus. And then you had the regime forces who were surrounding Damascus and really held the most populated areas. And it was kind of a stalemate for years. Back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. But ultimately, Assad ends up falling now, and why? A major, major component of this is October 7th. Hamas decides to invade Israel, slaughter and massacre civilians, as we've talked about ad nauseum on the show here. And Israel makes a decision that they're now going to respond in force against not only Hamas, but any of the other entities that are looking to destroy Israel. Who's a part of that? Hezbollah. So Israel goes into Lebanon and does a pretty big foot stomping on Hezbollah in Lebanon. Why does that matter? Because Hezbollah was tied to Assad. Iran was able to use Hezbollah as a security force supporting Assad in Damascus. And again, Hezbollah using Syria as a way to transport weapons from Iran and through. So there's this Iranian support to Assad through Hezbollah operating in Lebanon. When Israel goes after Hezbollah in Lebanon as a result of October 7th, Assad loses his connection. He loses that direct link to Iran. No longer can he get the weapons, the money, logistics, whatever it is, into Damascus to support his military in the same way. Russia's supporting, kind of, but not in the direct way with weapons and fighters and other things that Iran is. And so Hezbollah's gone, no connection to Iran. He can no longer support himself in the same way he has been since 2011. So what happens? HTS takes the role. HTS steps into the gap, the power vacuum, and starts taking villages slowly until it finally finds itself in Damascus. Eventually you get to the point, there's nothing Putin can do. He's not going to drop forces. He's not going to drop a brigade or a division of Russian forces in Damascus to protect Assad. He's not doing that. By the way, remember, Russia's fighting a war against Ukraine right now. Syria is important, but it's not Ukraine. And so Assad is looking at himself like, I got a problem. He ends up not being able to protect himself. He gets on a plane, heads out to Moscow. Now he's under diplomatic immunity given to him by Putin and, whatever, for obvious reasons, right? So Putin's protecting him out there in Moscow for everything that he being Assad did for Russia and blah, 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 blah. Russia started pulling out some of its forces, some of its, when I say forces, I don't mean necessarily armed soldiers running around, but there are support elements and, there's infrastructure and other things that are tied to Syria, and Russia's kind of protecting that stuff. Some of it is likely leaving, and Assad's gone. And so now HTS is the boss. This is not an outcome the United States would have necessarily liked if it had a choice, a ranked choice, right? I mean, given the relationship that the U.S. has with the SDF, you'd think that would be the decision. They would say the Kurdish-backed group, federalized, democratic, blah, blah, blah. That's the group that we would like to be in charge of Damascus. But nonetheless, everyone that's fighting against Assad, everyone wants Assad gone. So So what's going to happen now? So this Julani character, who I talked about, this formerly al-Qaeda aligned guy who the United States never supported coming out of the al-Nusra Front, he's now trying to convince the international community that he's the leader of the future Syria. He has started wearing Western clothes, so are his most closest advisors. They're wearing hoodies and jeans and other things. When he has an important meeting, he's meeting with some international partners, and he has an important meeting, he wears a suit, wears a black suit and a tie. And he's coming across as somebody that the world can deal with, that he is certainly a religious person. He's Muslim. I mean, come on, tied to al-Qaeda, right? He's a Sunni Muslim, but he's not necessarily interested in being a dictator and forcing the entire Syrian country to operate in his, in his conservative manner. And so you can deal with us, or deal with him rather. Is he another Bashar al-Assad in the sense that he came out as a moderate in the beginning? He marries a London-educated woman and tries to show himself as forward-thinking and moderate, but once in control, this Julani character is going to flip the script? I don't know. I think that's hard to tell. I'm sure there's some intel agencies out there that are working on this to try and figure this out. But I don't know. I guess we'll have to see. Is he just hungry for power and he's willing to give up some of his conservative nature outwardly in order to be the next leader, or at least have his people be the next leader? I don't know. He's claimed that there should be a transitional government coming in the next few months in the spring, and this transitional government will be responsible for creating a permanent government, writing a constitution. And Julani claims that he believes there will be a stable and permanent government within Syria within the next 3 or 4 years. That's the goal, and that's what he thinks that he can reach in whatever process is set up. Again, we'll have to see. The other groups still exist. The SDF is still there. Turkey still has its influence, still hates the Kurds. The United States has spent a lot of money on supporting the SDF. The SDF is not going to be interested in any overly religious power in Damascus. They want a secular federalized system. So what HTS is going to have to do is it's going to have to work on some coalition building. And it's going to have to open itself up to some discussions with the other power players there, because although HTS was the group that made it to Damascus, they're certainly not as well-funded and well-trained and as large as like the SDF, right? So the SDS still has a large role to play here. And how is that going to turn out? I don't think we're going to know. If they want it to last, they're going to end up having to build a coalition where everybody gets along. You look into history, I just don't know if that's going to happen. The other thing I say to people when talking about what's going to happen next in Syria, again, it's one of these things we don't know, but just know it doesn't have to last. And what I mean by that is that Syria is just a creation, at least its current borders, the current nation of Syria, is just a creation out of World War I. I mean, the border between Syria and Iraq is literally a straight line, because the French and the British just put a ruler on the map and decided this is where it was going to cut off. We never trust straight lines on a map, specifically when it crosses ethnic and cultural lines. I mean, no, I'm not talking about South and North Dakota, but I'm talking about Europe in particular, and really anywhere else. You don't trust solid lines because you know they're created by humans. And so just because ever since we were all born, Syria was a country, it doesn't mean it always has to be. Potentially, you could end up seeing the country dissolve, why not, into different factions, and it becomes a different country. How can it not be the case that maybe the Golan Heights, which Israel now has occupied since 1967 and now claims it's going to double the population going forward, who's to say that Israel doesn't annex officially the Golan Heights and Turkey takes X amount of kilometers south of its border into Syria, and the Syrian Democratic Forces don't set up a base of operations in another city in the northeast, and then eventually it just kind of dissolves and they all agree to be different nations? I'm not saying it's smart, and I'm not saying it's likely, but what I'm saying is don't rule it out. The history of these countries, particularly in the Middle East, are all colonialist. They come from the colonialist experience. And they were all created by humans, so that means they can all be destroyed by humans. It's not like we're talking about, the millennium deep and long history of the borders between Mongolia and China, right? Like this is different stuff. And so my answer is, as to what's going to happen next, is it's all going to be based on personalities. It's going to be based on the influence from the outside. How much does the United States want to get involved? How much does Russia want to remain involved? Does everybody want to agree to step back? What I mean by that, does Putin and the next administration in the United States and Erdogan, do they all want to just go, hey, let's just back up here and let the chips fall where they may and see what happens? That's potentially true, or potentially the case as well. I mean, I guess we're going to have to see. But as of right now, in the near term, it looks like Jelani is the guy. It looks like HTS is going to take the lead here and try and creating somewhat of a coalition government, and we'll see what happens. And it doesn't look like Israel's going to go any further. Again, they have the Golan Heights. That's important to them from a military defense strategy. Israel did go in after Assad's fall and destroyed a bunch of military weapons facilities because he didn't want Prime Minister Netanyahu and the IDF didn't want those weapons falling into the hands of some of the individuals that everybody hates, like ISIS and others, and people that were going to attempt to destroy Israel again, like they do all the time. So Israel made a strategic decision and went in and destroyed a bunch of that stuff. So, and then that would allow for external partners to more closely monitor what type of weapons the new Syrian government will get access to, right? If it's going to end up being some coalition of the willing to support them or whatever, but there's not going to be a bunch of weapons that were just laying around that'll end up in the hands of anybody. So, but as after that Israel incursion, if you will, there has not been anything more recent. Israel, again, focused on the ceasefire deal, what's happening down in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and they've actually attacked some of the Houthis down in Yemen too. So we'll see. I don't have an answer, and hopefully, though, that there's some type of a coalition that's built, and they can they can move forward with some type of a republic that's good for the people of Syria. That's what I think we would all like to see. All right. Hopefully that gives you a good understanding of what's happening in Syria today. A little bit of the background. Last episode, we talked about Bashar and his father, and then we talked about the groups that eventually started the civil war after the Arab Spring, and then how HTS eventually made it to Damascus, and we'll see what happens going forward. So thanks for joining me again today. Make sure you head out to headlinesandhistory.com for all your podcast information. Hit me up on social, Blue Sky X, YouTube, and the like. And then we'll be back next episode 46, to talk about the final topics within the Israel-Palestine conflict, right? Keep calling it that, conflict, and we'll address some things that came up as questions and other topics after I did the three-parter. So thanks for joining me again today, and I really look forward to seeing all of you next episode.